Iagwich agus fáilte roimh go léir ig an léit speisialta seo chun comóra a dhéanamh bhrá níomh Columcille, duine de fátrún na hÉireann. You're all very welcome to the seventh and final lecture to commemorate and celebrate the 15th centenary of the birth of St. Columcille, or Columba Viona, one of the patron saints of Ireland. My name is Alexander O'Hara. I'm the organizer of the series of lectures, which we started on the 9th of June, the feast day of Columba, and concludes today following the traditional birth date of Columba, which was last week on the 7th of December. This evening's lecture, which is the seventh in our series, will last about 50 minutes, and there will be time for discussion and Q&A afterwards. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and co-author, Justin Colvin, who will deliver this evening's lecture. J. Michel Reaux Colvin is an adjunct professor in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, where he teaches in both the language and culture tracks. A specialist in ethnic thinking in the late antique and early medieval Latin West, he has taught courses on the barbarian migrations, Celts as an ethnic category, interpretation of semantic difference in antiquity, modern receptions of Roman political ideation, ancient and late antique historiography, late Roman social history in the Latin West, and the uses of the natural sciences in the study of the pre-modern past. Justin and I are presently working on a co-authored volume entitled From Savagery to Sanctity and Back Again, Imagining Ireland, the Irish, and Irishness from Antiquity to the Coming of the English. And Justin has new work coming out in Olus and Classics Ireland. Justin, you're very welcome and great to have you.
Thank you, Alex. I wish I could say that the fine conveners of this lecture series had resolved to save the best for last. Alas, I think they've elected to serve me now for fear I'd spoil otherwise. Still, it's a great pleasure to address you this evening, and I sincerely thank you for tuning in. There's a tendency in scholarship to think of Bede as a historian of the early English par excellence, and Bede himself is perhaps to blame for this view. Indeed, his 5-book Historia ecclesiastica Hintus Anglorum, completed in 731, and which he viewed as his magnum opus, is somewhat deceptively titled. In it, Bede tasks himself with understanding and explaining the process and progress of Christianity over the first few centuries of the English Middle Ages. His overriding view is that the church is the vehicle for unity, particularly ethnic unity, and that a world subsumed within the church is a world well ordered. Since the intervention of Walter Goffert in his epic-making monograph, The Narrators of Barbarian History, it has become commonplace to acknowledge that far from a distant, disinterested, dispassionate recorder of events, Bede was an artful craftsman of prose, possessed of an agendum, approximate, deeply interested, and partisan. This paper will investigate Bede's reception of Irish visionary literature and exegesis as constituents to his autoethnography, his sacral geography, and his building of social networks. Ultimately, I will argue that Bede was a deep appreciator of things Irish, as evinced by the Historia Ecclesiastica, and that this appreciation was brokered to continental Europe in his magnum opus, as his magnum opus was disseminated there, thus establishing a wide appreciation for the Scotici Peregrini pro Cristo in the Carolingian and post-Carolingian Middle Ages. In 597, Bede records, the septuagenarian St. Columba was breathing his last breath on Iona, as Adamnán tells us, with the head of a pious white horse reclining onto his breast. As all gathered here are aware, and as Bede himself was likewise aware, Columba's missionary activities had brought the word of God to those who to Patrick were apostate Picts. In so doing, Columba and his monastic familia, centered around Iona and later its daughter houses, could make a reasonable claim for being among the missionary avant-garde, a role much relished in later Irish evangelical self-appraisal. But Iona did not pass with Columba. Rather, Bede tells us Columba's successors hold the island to this day, which from Bede's perspective in 731 meant a continuous and unbroken Irish exclave in the Hebrides for nearly 170 years, assuming Bede did not confuse the year in which Columba inaugurated his exile, 565. But on July 23rd, 596, according to an epistola of Gregory the Great, which Bede cites in the first book and 23rd chapter of the Historia ecclesiastica, the Pope had dispatched Augustine to Canterbury. His subsequent chapter reproduces a letter ostensibly addressed to Etherius, Archbishop of Arles, an obvious confusion. Etherius was at this time Archbishop of Lyon, and Virgilius was the Archbishop of Arles. In any case, the letter Bede actually cites was addressed by Gregory to Pelagius, then Archbishop of Tours, and Serenus, then Bishop of Marseille. In Bede's confusion, Bede subtly invents for Augustine a reiterative arrival in Britain, enjoining the imaginary Etherius of Arles that he might receive benignly Augustine while going to Britain. Bede evidently thought this process took the better part of a year because he writes in 596, Pope Gregory sent Augustine to Britain with monks who came to Britain in 597. Whether Bede suffered a misunderstanding or not, his reckoning, the arrival of in 597 of Augustine of Canterbury, has become confessional in the discipline. Thus, 597, according to Bede's reckoning, marked not only the passing of Iona's founder, but also the arrival to Canterbury of Augustine, a papally sanctioned bishop whose ministry was, in the eyes of Bede at least, to be the avenue by which his gentes anglorum received the light of faith. Thus, as the old light waned in the north, a new light shone from the south, and Bede's own native Northumbria was to be the field of contestation on which these two traditions would abut one another, famously at the Council of Whitby in 664. Now, to my mind, there's few ways to look at this doublet. The most credulous among us would take Bede at his word. Augustine happened to arrive the very year Columba was passing as a stroke of serendipity. In this view, the coincidence was a mere fact of the calendar, and Bede was essentially accurate. The more circumspect among us might argue that these historical personages may have shared one special year, but the intervention of Bede himself subtly overlaid the significance of this relationship. The most critical here could impugn Bede with chronological malfeasance, either a mistake born of ignorance or, less charitably, forcing his personages into some sort of ideological program. I'm constitutionally inclined to the middle path, but I find much to commend the criticism. Whatever the case, Bede's message appears rather clear. The vanguard of one mission passed away while the agent of a new mission appeared on the scene. The other talks in this series have provided us with much to think about as regards Columba. We've heard so many excellent talks about Columba, his background, his character, his life's work, and more. In this talk, I want to do something else. Columba, of course, was Irish, but what did that mean? What materials speak to ethnographic appraisals of Columba's Irishness? But most importantly, how did Bede himself esteem Irishness itself? Paradoxically, the writings that survive from Irish pens won't necessarily aid us in this enterprise. To peek into the ethnic scripts by which early medieval thinkers made sense of the people who surrounded them, we must look at moments in which Irish people were ethnic others in the sight of our authors, and as near as we can, peel back the layers of meaning which have accreted around their alterity. Bede mentions Columba twice. Bede's account of Columba's life is quite out of place with the chronology of the events he narrates. In the 4th chapter of his 3rd book, Bede writes, "Indeed, in the year of the incarnation of the Lord, 565, at which time Justin the Younger received the reins of the Roman Empire after Justinian, a priest and abbot, Columba by name, distinguished by his monastic demeanor of life, came from Ireland to Britain in order to preach the word of God to the provinces of the northern Picts, which are separated from their southern regions by a sheer and shuddering range of mountains. Moreover, he came to Britain at the time when Brokerage, son of Malcolm, was a most powerful king, was reigning the Picts. In the 9th year of his reign, and he converted that people to the faith of Christ by word and deed. And in this way, he received the aforementioned island of Iona from them into his own possession in order to establish a monastery there. For it is not a large island, but about 5 hides, according to the estimation of the Angles. and which his successors hold all the way up to the present day, and where he himself was buried when he held 77 years, about 32 years after he came to Britain to preach. Moreover, he had made, before he came to Britain, a noble monastery in Ireland, which from the copious amounts of oaks is known as Jermach, that is, field of oaks, in the language of the Irish. From either monastery, there sprung many monasteries through his disciples, both in Britain and Ireland, over all of which that same Insular monastery, in which his corpse lies, holds supremacy. Thus, from Bede's very first mention of Columba, his memory is threaded through with reference to Iona. In Bede's mind, the monastic familia of Iona seems an allodial holding of Columba and his successors, who likewise seem to exert patrimonial influence over the monastic praxis and religious doctrine of Iona's daughter houses. But significantly, Columba appears here as a missionary evangelist, responsible for the conversion of one of Britain's 5 peoples. More on that in a bit. Bede's second mention of Columba may appear at first to be somewhat more circumspect. In the 25th chapter of his 3rd book, Bede narrates his account of the aforementioned Council of Whitby in 664. Bede, drawing from but expanding upon and subtly critiquing Stephanus's Vita Wilfridi, chapter 10, describes a council convened in the newly established kingdom of United Northumbria by Oswiu and his son Alfrith, which sought to reconcile so-called Roman customs and Ionan customs, especially as regards the celebration of Easter. Against Colvin, Bishop of Lindisfarne, Bede, writing in the voice of Wilfrid, the Roman partisan of this disputation, says, "It stands that Anatolius, a man most holy, most learned, and most deserving of praise, follows a rule of especial truth in his Easter, of whose rule of distinguishing Easter it seems y'all are ignorant. However, against your father Columba and his followers, whose sanctity you claim to imitate, and whose rule and precepts, having been confirmed by heavenly signs you claim to follow, I am able to respond. For although your fathers were holy, surely a scarcity of them from one corner of a remote island is not to be preferred to the universal church of Christ. And if this Columba of yours, rather ours also, if he was of Christ, was holy and powerful with respect to virtues, then was he able to be preferred to the most blessed prince of the apostles, to whom the Lord said, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And to you I give the keys of the kingdom of heaven." And thus, Colvin and his Iona contingent lost favor of the royal house of Northumbria. Bede continues, "With Wilfrid saying these things, the king said, were these words, O Colvin, truly said by the Lord to Peter, who said, truly, O king?" Now, the issue hinged on Wilfrid's presentation of Jesus's ecclesiological enjoinder in Matthew 7:18-19. Moreover, Jesus responding to him said, "You are blessed, Simon Bar-Jonah," that is Peter, "for flesh and blood have not revealed it to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say to you, because you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you will have bound on earth will be bound also in heaven, and whatsoever you will have loosed on earth will be loosed also in heaven." Of course, Bede here is cribbing a quite similar exchange as recorded in Stephanus's Vita Wilfridi, but with a substantially less vituperative and biased voice. While Stephanus seems more concerned with extirpating Irish religious sensibilities more wholly, Bede seems a bit more conciliatory. While surely witnessing a degree of reticence to express outright enthusiasm for Irish religious among the early medieval English, the anxiety seems here was both with orthopraxy, that is correct religious behavior, and orthodoxy, that is correct religious belief. And he voices it in less fiery terms than his senior contemporary. If these two testimonia were treated in isolation, then Bede would seem to advance an ambivalent opinion about the Irish as exemplified by Columba. On the one hand, they were useful missionaries. On the other hand, they were doctrinally dangerous. Indeed, this perceived ambivalence has proven grist for the mill of modern historians. Was Bede a hibernophobe avant la lettre? Was Bede a house-proud English nationalist, again, avant la lettre? Or perhaps Bede was a covert hibernophile? It's my contention that Bede, in thinking about the Irish, instrumentalized them as essential to the salvific trajectory of the English church. Apart from mere agents of evangelization, in Bede's eyes, the Irish were eschatologically significant, representing one among a pentad of Christian nationes that fulfilled the promise of Acts 1:7-8. It is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. The Irish, for Bede, were intimately connected with these anxieties about orthodoxy and orthopraxy, but this ironically enjoins both the Irish and English to cleave to the mother church and also, crucially, cleave together as well. If we want to see Bede's healthy esteem for things Irish, it helps to isolate examples of his sustained consideration of matters Irish. Everywhere in the Historia Ecclesiastica, we can find Irish people. Bede mentions them using the ethnonym Scotus and its like 89 distinct times. As Sarah McCann has recently noted, of the 353 named individuals in the Historia Ecclesiastica, 35 are described as Irish. Thus, in a sense, 10% of Bede's text is given over to considerations of Irish figures. The bulk of these mentions come in his third book, in which Bede mentions the word Scotus 46 times. The Bede conveys to his readers an assessment of the Irish very similar to that found in the works of Adamnán of Iona and more regularly in continental assessments of the Scoti Peregrini, pious, learned, itinerant. As Walter Goffert remarks, the Historia Ecclesiastica leaves us in no doubt about the magnitude and beauty of the Irish contribution to Northumbrian Christianity. Now, Bede was no stranger to thinking in ethnic terms. While the totality of his Historia Ecclesiastica can be read as an exercise in autoethnographic testimony, it seems that Bede saw some special place set aside in Anglic Christendom for his far westerly neighbors. Autoethnography, according to Mary Louise Pratt, refers to instances in which colonized subjects undertake to represent themselves in ways that engage with the colonizer's terms. If ethnographic texts are a means by which colonizers represent to themselves their usually subjugated others, autoethnographic texts are texts the others construct in response to or in dialogue with those metropolitan representations. Autoethnography involves partly collaborating with and appropriating the idioms of the conqueror. Autoethnographic texts are typically heterogeneous on the reception end, usually addressed both to metropolitan readers and to the literate sectors of the speaker's own social group. Often such texts constitute a group's point of entry into metropolitan lettered culture. Emma Dench, writing about the Romans' use of the written word as a means of self-fashioning and discursive presentation, describes autoethnography as, quote, the placing of selves as framed by the imagined gaze of others. Bede, in this case, is using the conventions of ecclesiastical history, a genre pioneered by Eusebius, perfected by Orosius, and adapted for the nations by Gregory of Tours, the works of each of whom Bede knew well, in order to make explicable the process of progress of English Christianity. And in so doing, he was no stranger to making ethnicities into villains, for example, the Britons, and heroes, for example, as I shall argue, the Irish. But more to the point, Bede lays out an argument for the centrality of ethnicity in the study of salvific history. Bede writes, at the present time, there are 5 languages in Britain, just as the divine law is written in 5 books, all devoted to seeking out and setting forth one and the same kind of wisdom, namely the knowledge of sublime truth and true sublimity. These are the English, British, Irish, and the Pictish, as well as the Latin languages. Through the study of the scriptures, Latin is in general use among them all. While it might be tempting to read Irish religious involvement in the nascent Anglican church in light of his contemporaries like Aldhelm and Edius Stephanus, both writing a generation before Bede, I think Bede casts the Irish in a wholly different role. And I'll give you a sense for what I mean. Aldhelm, in his Epistola ad Heofrithum, written around 677, enjoins the recipient not to go learn in Ireland, constructing an elaborately chiastic letter hinging around Proverbs 5, 15, 17. Drink water from your own cisterns and the streams of your own well. Let your fountains be diverted abroad and divide the waters in broad streets. Keep them alone, and let not strangers be sharers of your own things. The letter intends to discount the learning of the 7th century Irish and argues that a superior, or at least comparable, education is available in the English domains. He even obliquely maligns the Irish language, beginning his missive with a tongue-twisting alliterative string of 15 voiceless bilabial plosives. Shongelge, as the Irish-educated Aldhelm knew well, lacked that phoneme, so no p. Likewise, the Bishop Wilfrid of Stephanus, whose work was written after the saint's death in 709, but before 720, positively luxuriates in his anti-Irish sentiment, saying, "Was I not the first to eradicate the poisonous weeds planted by the Irish?" Elsewhere, similar bile. Now there are here in Britain many bishops whom it is not for me to criticize, but I know truly that there are quartordecimans like the Britons and the Irish and more. The British and the Irish are schismatics. Anti-Irish sentiment was not a foreign property to the early medieval English. And really, this estimation is a continuation of the rhetoric of Irish barbarism, identifiable in the works of Ammianus Marcellinus, Claudian, Jerome, Gildas, and others. While Bede's historical imagination is foundationally theological, his theological imagination is largely ethnographic. Time for Bede is providential, that is, God's truth expressed through popular confidence is the true law of history, free from error and immune to mere fact. But his concern is with God's dispensation vis-a-vis ethnicity. Bede's approach to scripture is ethnological, and his approach to the study of the past is likewise ethnographic. Principal among Bede's animating themes is reconciliation and unity in the church, and given his propensity to think of ethnicity in soteriological terms, it is no surprise that Bede spends much of his Historia ecclesiastica occupied with the Irish. Alongside the two hibernophobes just mentioned, it is tempting to suspect that their junior compatriot, Bede, especially in light of his treatment of the Colvin faction at the Council of Whitby, might be like-minded. Instead, we find everywhere that he tempers any episode that might cast the Irish in a negative light. For example, in the Historia Ecclesiastica, Book 1, chapters 12 and 14, Bede, drawing on Gildas, treats us to two episodes during which the then pagan Irish harangued the Britons of the late Roman period, around the mid-5th century CE. In the former chapter, Bede records that Britain, in the region of the Britons, having been alacritously plundered of every armed soldier, every variety of materiel, and the whole flower of its youth, which had been led away by means of the temerity of tyrants never to return home, lay wholly open to plunder. Inasmuch as everyone was wholly ignorant of the craft of war, then immediately Britain was stunned by two vehemently savage transmarine gentes, the Irish from the northwest and the Picts from the north, and groaned for many years. The depredations of these Irish pirates resulted in the Britons unsuccessfully soliciting aid from the recently decamped Romans. As no aid was forthcoming, a famine grips Britain, and in the latter chapter, Bede relates, "Meanwhile, the aforementioned famine, afflicting the Britons more and more, and leaving behind to posterity a long-lasting memory of its evil, compelled many of them to give up arms, having been conquered by the dangerous pirates. Others, however, did not. These, trusting rather in divine aid when human aid was failing, continually fighting back from the mountains, caves, and forests, finally began to give fight to the enemy who for many years were plundering in the land. Therefore, the shameless robbers returned back to their Irish home, intending to return before long. Then, thereafter, the Picts also finally settled down in the extreme part of the island, though they did not cease to conduct predations and griefs occasionally." So, in Bede's reckoning, the 5th century Irish were predatory interlopers. But this interpretation misses what is surely the thrust of these episodes. Bede wraps the Irish invasion of Britain and their retreat from Britain around an account of their Christianization, which he records in Book 1, Chapter 13, writing, "In the year of the incarnation of the Lord, 423, Theodosius the Younger, receiving the emperorship after Honorius, being the 45th from Augustus, in the 8th year of his reign, Palladius was sent by Celestine, Pope of the Roman Church, to the Irish believing in Christ as their first bishop. So Bede is tempering potentially damaging reports of Irish misadventure with the mechanism by which their behavior might be corrected. Moreover, it is precisely this sustained engagement with the predatory Irish that induces the Britons to solicit aid not from Rome, but from a coalition of Northern Europeans, Bede's Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. In the Historia Ecclesiastica, Book 1, Chapter 15, Bede writes, "Then the Gens of the Angles and the Saxons, having been invited by Vortigern, came to Britain in 3 longboats and received a place to hold in the eastern part of the island at the order of this same king, as if about to fight on behalf of the country, but really in order to conquer it. Therefore, they who had come received from the giving Britons a place of habitation among them on this condition, namely, that these people might militate for the peace and health of the country against the adversaries, and these people conferred appropriate stipends upon the soldiers." So Bede leads us to believe that the whole raison de passer, that the English arrived in Britain in the first place, is directly attributable to Irish intervention. The narrative presented in these 4 chapters might at first appear hostile to the Irish, but when we take the narrative as a whole, we can observe the arc in a different light. So first, the Irish desolate Britain, then they are evangelized, then the Irish decamp back to Ireland, and finally Bede's own ethnic group arrives. To treat this sustained episode as an index of Irish barbarity is to precisely miss the point. Bede tempers any episode or event that might be considered disparaging of the Irish with the potential of their deliverance into the church. Indeed, for Bede, the Anglican coalition's arrival in the Promised Land is the result of Irish intervention. So too does Bede's account of the resolution of the Easter controversy sound a conciliatory note. In Book 5, Chapter 22, which happens to be the penultimate episode of Bede's narrative, Bede recounts that in 716, those who were living on the island of Iona, namely the monks of the Irish Natio, together with those monasteries who had been subjoined to them, were brought by the care of the Lord into the canonical rite of Easter reckoning and tonsure. This reconciliation of the conflict, first voiced by Columbanus and then articulated in the Council of Whitby, was effectuated by a fellow Northumbrian monastic, Egbert by name, and Bede sees this mild correction to the practices of the Irish as a debt owed. It is certain that this Easter reconciliation came about owing to a marvelous dispensation of divine mercy, since that gens had taken the trouble to communicate freely and without malice to the English people that knowledge of divine thinking which it had come to know. Likewise, through the ministration of the gens of the English, may it presently come to a perfect standard of living in those things which it had lacked. Bede's language here reinforces a sense of intimate relationship between the Irish and the early medieval English. Bede seems intent on presenting the Irish in a positive light. The 2 groups were essential to the other's salvation. The picture that emerges is, for Bede, a characterization of the Irish as an inoffensive gens who are the greatest friends of the natio of the English. So in episodes where we might read the author as derogating the Irish and Irishness, Bede subjoins positive interpretations of them, almost as if he is cautioning his readers not to understand the Irish people negatively. Certainly, he tells us many things about the Irish that he intended his audience to read negatively, but he intersperses each of these episodes with information that would be redeeming. The heft of his account then leads us to the conclusion that Bede appreciated Irish contributions to English cultural formation and Christianity, and regarded them as partners, if ulterior partners, to the process and progress of English Christianity. A useful comparandum to Bede's vision of the Irish as heroic, or if not heroic, at least not villainous, would be the group that Bede everywhere vituperates against, the Britons. 2 examples of Bede's anti-British animus will suffice, one drawn from the first book, the other from his last. In Book 1, Chapter 22, Bede writes, "And the Britons, among other deeds of indescribable criminality, which their own Historius Gildus describes in weeping words, added this crime, namely that they never committed by means of preaching the word of faith to the gentes of the Saxons or of the Angles living with them in Britannia. But nevertheless, divine piety did not desert his people whom he foreknew, but he arranged for a much worthier heralds of the spoken truth, through whom it might be believed. The crime, as Bede calls it, that the Britons committed was the refusal to evangelize the early medieval English, then pagan at the point of their arrival. The worthier heralds were the Irish. However, Bede attempts to rationalize his bias, it seems clear that the Britons specifically are incapable of social, religious, and salvific development. In his final narrative chapter of Book 5, Chapter 23, he writes, the Britons, however, for the most part, oppose both the gens of the Angles because of their inbred hatred and the state of the whole Catholic Church because of their incorrect Easter and their dreadful customs. However, because of their utterly resisting both divine and human virtue, in neither are they able to attain their desired proposition. For though they are partly of their own law, they have been partly surrendered to the service of the Angles. Now, the reason for Bede's hostility to the Britons and his relative comity with things Irish are not immediately clear, but the depth of his animus might be explained by what psychologists call the proximity principle, or the tendency of geographical proximity to deepen the emotional experience of relationships. As Augustine reminds us in Scala Paradisi, nimia familiaritas paret contemptum, excessive familiarity bears contempt. In this case, the fact that the Britons were proximate to Monk's Wearmouth Yarrow, being a stone's throw away in Cumbria and Strathclyde, may have intensified Bede's antipathy. But whatever the case, as Bede spins his yarn, the Britons were inveterate villains and the Irish qualified heroes. Hopefully the foregoing has convinced you that Bede was either A, minimally tolerant of the Irish presence in English Christian circles, or B, maximally enthusiastic about the Irish presence in English Christian circles, but definitely not C, overtly hostile to the presence of Irish in English Christian circles. For the remainder of this talk, I want to present a case that Bede was actually quite a fan of the Irish religious. And in order to do that, I will focus on acts of reception that Bede witnesses, whereby he elects to incorporate two Irish voices that are essential to his salvation of salvific vision of Christianity. But first, I need to talk about what reception is and how Bede does it. On one level, reception is a delightfully simple idea. Temporal priority by demand constrains and enables subsequence. As uncontroversial as it is to say, an author is the product of his or her own reading. Reception is an act of epistemic humility, an acknowledgement of the contingency of one's own contribution to a much larger conversation. As Ecclesiastes 1:9-10 says, what is that which was done? What is that which will be? What is that which has been done? What is that which will be done? There is nothing new under the sun, neither is anyone able to say, behold, this thing is new, for already it has gone before in ages which have been before us. Bede appears to wear his ponderous learning especially lightly, and heroic attempts have been made to determine the contents of his library at Monk's Wearmouth Yarrow, which had been assembled by Benedict Bishop, the founder and first abbot from about 674 of St. Peter's in Monk's Wearmouth. Indeed, to Bede's mind, the assembly of the Abbey library was the precondition for the foundation of the Abbey itself, as he records in his Historia Abbatum. When Benedict ruled the monastery for 2 years, undertaking a third journey from Britain to Rome, he completed it with equal success, and he brought back books of all kinds of divine erudition, not a few, and having been purchased at a pleasing price, and generously given gifts of friends. Coming back, when he came to Vienne, he picked up the books he had purchased, which he had left there with his friends. And turning his step to the land in which he was born, he came to Egfrid, the king of the Northumbrian region, and told the king everything that had been done since he deserted his homeland as a youth. He did not conceal the desire which was burning for religion. He revealed that which he had learned in the church and that which he had learned in the monastic institutions at Rome and everywhere else. He revealed how many divine books, how many relics of the blessed apostles and martyrs of Christ he had brought back. And Egfrid took to Benedict with so much grace and familiarity that immediately he gave him a land of 70 hides from his own holdings, and he told him to build a monastery there to the first pastor of the church, that is St. Peter. Indeed, Bede attributes his ability to compose the Historia Ecclesiastica entirely to the presence of his excellent library. And this is a folio from the Codex Amiatinus, which was produced at Monk's Wearmouth Jarrow. And this purports to show Ezra in the library, of course, of Monk's Wearmouth Jarrow. So this could indeed be Bede's library, or at least a vision of it. So what books did Bede's library possess? Even if we restrict ourselves to book one, we can observe Bede's aesthetic of bricolage. His monumental history is a veritable patchwork tapestry woven out of his prodigious learning and excellent library. In book one alone, Bede references, alludes to, or quotes outright Pliny the Elder, Solinus, Orosius, Gildas, Basil of Caesarea, a version of the Liber Pontificalis, Vegetius, Venantius Fortunatus, a version of the Passio Albani, the Breviarium of Eutropius, Prosper of Aquitaine, Marcellinus Comes, Constantius of Lyons, Vita Germani, an anonymous Vita Lupi, a register of letters, and a libellus responsionum of both of Gregory the Great and others that have lamentably escaped my attention. A few observations are immediately apparent. First, somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of his first book is sourced from elsewhere, assembled from disparate sources into a coherent, continuous narrative. Second, Bede operates using three styles of reception: homage, allusion, and citation. Homage, which instructors of contemporary undergraduates might call plagiarism, incorporates source materials without attribution, but nearly word for word. An example would be Book 1, Chapter 6, which is almost wholly cribbed from Orosius's Historia contra Paganos, Book 7, Chapter 25. Allusion, by which Bede incorporates his source materials more freely and crucially provides attribution, is perhaps best seen in his treatment of the De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae of Gildas, whom he mentions by name in Book 1, Chapter 22. An example of Bede's elusive tendencies can be seen in Book 1, Chapter 12. Finally, much of the end of Book 1, from the 23rd chapter to the final chapter, is occupied with citation. In this case, from a Liber Epistolarum of Gregory the Great. An especially fine example would be chapter 24. So Bede's reception of these works could be taken as an expression of his esteem. By incorporating the works he chooses to incorporate, he is placing an imprimatur of positive regard on them. This becomes especially important when we consider how Bede received and esteemed the works of Irish monastics. I want to focus on two acts of reception here: Bede's account of the vision of Fursey in Book 3, Chapter 19, and most importantly, his reception and réécriture of Adamnán of Iona's De Locis Sanctis in Book 5, Chapters 15 through 17. I contend that Bede's decision to incorporate his reception of these two salvifically central interventions from two individuals he acknowledges as being Irish speaks to his thinking of the centrality of the Irish to questions of evangelization and religious praxis. That Bede would receive and replicate Irish materials is not necessarily surprising. But I contend much can be understood about Bede's estimation of the Irish by noting precisely what materials he elected to press into the service of his Historia Ecclesiastica. Sometime in the 630s, a holy man came from Ireland, Fursa by name, famous with respect to word and deeds, and also remarkable with respect to his extraordinary virtues, desiring to lead his life as a pilgrim wheresoever he might manage to get the opportunity. He was afforded this opportunity by Sigebert of East Anglia, and the monastery he built was pleasantly located in the vicinity of woods and the sea, having been built in a certain Roman camp, which is called Knobhersberg in the language of the Angles. Precisely where this castle is debatable, but Bede is clear about Furse's ethnicity. This man was from the most noble gens of the Irish, but he was far nobler with respect to spirit than the flesh. But Bede was far more interested in Furse's visions. The story he recounts is of soteriological significance. Once, having been seized by a certain infirmity of the body, he proved deserving to enjoy an angelic vision, in which he was warned to maintain diligently the ministration of the word he had begun. He was snatched from his body, and having been cast out of his body from evening to the crow of the cock, he proved deserving both to hear the blessed praises and look upon the faces of the angelic host. Another time, Furse was privileged to a vision of hellfire and the fires of purgation. And, I quote, deflecting his eyes downward, he saw some kind of dark valley in a place immediately beneath him. And he saw 4 fires in the air, distant from one another by not much space. These 4 fires, his angelic psychopomp tells him, are reserved for liars, the covetous, those responsible for discord, and the impious. Furse himself was physically altered by this vision, as Bede alleges that the burns he suffered while his soul beheld this vision manifested on his physical body. Thus, Furse's experience stands as reportage of the promise of reward and punishment, an entire soteriological cosmology. God selected one among the Irish for a tour through this unseen world. That's not a mistake. Historically, this account, along with elements of Gregory the Great's Dialogi, have been read as constituent to the development of the doctrine of purgatory, which, okay, fine. But I think that it's especially relevant that Bede elects to frame the exposure of this knowledge as having flowed from the experience of an Irish person. The second example of Bede's reception of Irish materials occurs in the Historia Ecclesiastica, book 5, 15 to 17, which also happens to be the only time that Bede intentionally incorporates the materials of an Irish author. Writing sometime in the 680s, Adamnán of Iona wrote a short tract in 3 books entitled De Locis Sanctis. Adamnán was abbot of Iona, and he produced a vita of his monastery's founder, quite likely around 697, in order to celebrate the centenary of the founder's death. It does not seem that Bede knew Adamnán's Vita Sancti Columbae. He gives no indication of knowing it in the Historia Ecclesiastica. We do know, however, that Bede knew very well Adamnán's De Locis Sanctis because he engaged in a réécriture of the work 2 times. First, in his own De Locis Sanctis, dating from around 703 or 704, and second in book 5, chapters 15 to 17 of the Historia Ecclesiastica. Bede rewrote Adamnán's De Locis Sanctis ostensibly to clear up Adamnán's style, which, while not hermeneutic a la Aldhelm or Hesperic, was certainly, as Bede says, an example of sermo-lakiniosis. Whatever the case, Bede's rewriting surely did make Adamnán's account more brief and concise. Adamnán's De Locis Sanctis was written in 3 books. And the first is the city of Jerusalem. The first book concerns the city of Jerusalem. The second book concerns various sites around the Holy Land. And a third is a tour of Alexandria and Constantinople. As Thomas O'Loughlin notes, this tacks quite closely to the order of operations as laid out in Luke 24, 45 to 48. The maps that can be reproduced of his account of the Holy Land, this is the map for book 1, the map for book 2, and the map for book 3. So Adamnán claims that he received his information from an uncertain Arculf, whom he describes as a holy bishop, a Gaul with respect to gens. Adamnán claims that he is recording directly from the reportage of this Arculf details about the Holy Land, serving, in a sense, as little more than an amanuensis. Adamnán mentions Arculf 73 times. Adamnán does not reveal the occasion of the visit of this Arculf, but Bede, in both his rewriting of Adamnán's De Locis Sanctis and in the Historia Ecclesiastica, claims that Arculf, when he wanted to go home, the ship in which he was a passenger, wandered about with contrary winds. And he was finally brought to our own island, that of the Britons, and at length, having faced some dangers, he came to the Reverend Father Adamnán. Then he explained his journey and what he had seen and made Adamnán into the author of a very beautiful narrative. Bede tells us that Adamnán himself brought a copy of De Locis Sanctis to the kingdom of Northumbria on a visit to Aldfrith, then king. Bede writes, accordingly, Adamnán, a priest and an abbot of the monks who were on the island of Iona, having been sent by his gens for the sake of a legation to Aldfrith, the king of the Angles, and having delayed for some time in this province in order that he might see the canonical rites of the church, was changed with respect to mind, so much so that the things which he saw and heard in the churches of the Angles, he preferred most readily the customs of them to his own custom. Adamnán himself mentions this visit in the Vita Columbae, and it is very likely that it was during this trip abroad that Adamnán extended this book to King Aldfrith, and through the largesse of that man, it was handed over to lesser people for the purpose of reading. So what's going on here? Much of what we now understand about Adamnán's De Locis Sanctis flows from the pen of Thomas O'Loughlin, previously mentioned, and a co-presenter in this series, whose many publications on De Locis Sanctis culminated in an excellent monograph in 2007. The substance of O'Loughlin's ministrations are three. First, that Adamnán's attribution to his information to Arculf is a pious fiction. Arculf, in O'Loughlin's view, is a literary confection, a pied à terre saint that allowed Adamnán the opportunity to engage in his exposition. Second, Adamnán's actual compositional process was not as an amanuensis, but rather as a researcher, drawing knowledge from his deep reading in his excellent library on Iona, particularly the Bible itself, the works of Eusebius, Eucharius, Jerome, and an abridgment of Josephus attributed to Hegesippus. And third, that Adamnán's intent in this composition was rather more exegetical than practical. What Adamnán hoped to produce was not a travel guide, but a textual commentary, an aid to scriptural interpretation rather than a periplus, a work of hermeneutic, not a Murray's Guide. All of these interventions I accept, and they do much to improve our understanding of Adamnán's intent in the fabrication of De Locis Sanctis. However, we have missed the ethnic dimension of Bede's reception of Adamnán's work. Bede elected to rewrite Adamnán not once, but twice. His initial attempt at adapting Adamnán's work was among Bede's earliest attempts at biblical scholarship. And in it, he removed Adamnán's sophisticated three-book structure, incapitulating it instead, and he removed all but two references to Arculf. In Bede's DLS, De Locis Sanctis, he acknowledges that he is adapting from Adamnán only in chapter 19, 4-5, at the very end of the work, almost as an afterthought. 30 years later, when next he adapted Adamnán's De Locis Sanctis, he attributes to Adamnán the authorship before introducing a much abbreviated version. There are two interesting elements of Bede's second episode of Réécriture. First, while Bede attributes authorship of the geography of the Holy Land to Adamnán, he is actually quoting from his own adaptation of De Locis Sanctis, undertaken nearly 30 years before. So while he acknowledges the source of his inspiration, he is actually only alluding to the original. Second, Bede only incorporates 4 geographical features of the Holy Land into the Historia Ecclesiastica. What he chose to incorporate is revealing. This is the chapter where he is discussing Bethlehem and its environs. Here is the chapter where he is discussing Golgotha and Jerusalem. Here is where he is discussing Mount Olivet in Jerusalem as well. And here is where he discusses Hebron and the tombs of the patriarchs. Thus, what Bede has done is tell the story of Jesus's life. the nativity, the crucifixion and resurrection, and the ascension, using the geographical locales that served as the theater for these events. Only once Jesus's life is narrated does Bede turn to the tombs of the patriarchs. The idea would seem to be that the mechanism of salvation takes priority to the study of deeper time. Not incidentally, these 3 chapters of Bede's magnum opus represent Bede's only attempt in the Historia Ecclesiastica to narrate the life of Christ, and he attributes this narration to an Irish author. The types of Irish reportage that Bede elects to include are important indices for his perception of Irish people more broadly. In his inclusion of First's vision, Bede allows a sacral cosmology, an account of salvation and damnation, to fall from Irish lips. In his inclusion of Adamnán's De Locis Sanctis, Bede attributes knowledge of sacral geography, the theater of salvation itself, to an Irish voice. Effectively, what Bede has done is to incorporate 2 prose maps, one celestial, one earthly, both essential to salvation history, and both sourced from Irish individuals. Thus, it would seem that for Bede that the Irish speak with numinous knowledge. Indeed, that the voice of salvation speaks with a brogue. Beginning shortly after Bede's death in 735, manuscripts of the Historia Ecclesiastica positively flooded the libraries of Europe. His erudition and learning were legendary. In a letter to Huatbert, the abbot at Monk's Wearmouth Yarrow when Bede died, Boniface of Mainz requests Bede's works. Among other things, we ask that you consider sending us some copies of the writings of the little works of the monk Bede, that most wise investigator of the scriptures, whom we have learned recently departed from you to the house of God. His knowledge of scripture beamed like a church candle. Notker the Stammerer heaped praise on Bede. Should any Roman doubt the eloquent writings of barbarian men, the exposition of the barbarian Bede in his book seems to us to suffice. God, the arranger of nature, who on the 4th day of the world's creation placed a sun in the east, in the 6th age of the world established a new sun in the west in order to illuminate the whole world. And so his works entered the monastic libraries of Europe in numbers commensurate with his prestige. No fewer than 86 witnesses of the Historia Ecclesiastica antedating the 12th century survived throughout Europe, with 5 surviving from the 8th century alone. The enormous popularity of Bede's work exposed his readers to new ways of thinking about the Irish as an ethnic group. Bede essentially taught Europe how to think about the Irish. Bede's role here was as a cultural broker. A thinker with a foot in 2 worlds who makes one world sensible to the other. A cultural broker, in Philip A. Dennis's formulation, is competent in 2 cultures and languages who can relate 2 different groups to one another. According to Daniel K. Richter, such cultural brokers act as simultaneous members of 2 or more intersecting networks, kin groups, political factions, communities, or other formal or informal coalitions. Brokers provide nodes of communication with respect to a community's relations with the outside world, and they stand guard over the crucial junctures or synapses of relationships which connect the local system to a larger whole. The resulting maneuvering room allows skillful mediators to promote the aims of one group while protecting the interests of another, and thus to become nearly indispensable to all sides. So in a sense, Bede has translated his positive experience of Irish religiosity to a wider European readership. In Bede's case, the Irish, as discussed and described in the Historia Ecclesiastica, conditioned and enabled similar continental interpretations of them. Thus, Bede, perhaps unwittingly, brokered his positive esteem for the Irish to a larger European reading audience. The Scotici Peregrini pro Christo, the High Middle Ages, were in essence a Bedean product. Now, Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica, quite apart from its simultaneously regional and universalizing points of departure, became something of a lettre de course for the Irish in Europe. Bede was busied by an interest in demonstrating ecclesiastical unity as a precondition for political unity. He was concerned with questions of orthopraxy and concerned by heterodoxy. He sought to demonstrate the place of central importance of a unifying that the unifying church had. And the image of the Irish that emerges from Bede's work is one of devotion, piety, asceticism, peregrination, and potentially privileged knowledge of divine matters. The popularity of Bede's work coincided with the appearance of Irish itinerants in the European consciousness. Bede made the Irish sensible to Western European Christians who at the same time were developing their own familiarity with the Irish peregrini pro Christo, who were becoming a large contingent in the waxing monastic landscape of continental Europe. The Irish were undoubtedly present and active in continental Europe in the early Middle Ages, but we presently have no way of estimating the scale of this missionary activity. It was Bede who taught Europe how to think about the Irish, but it was the Irish themselves who traveled from Patrick's ends of the earth to the monasteries of Europe in order to be thought about. Significantly, Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica brokered his knowledge and understanding of the Irish to the continent, and thus was instrumental in forging the perception of Irish religious functionaries according to a script that Alexander O'Hara has called hibernal ethnosanctity, and I have elsewhere called scoticitas, the belief that the Irish were uniquely saintly, religiously adept, and it's scatologically significant. So pervasive was this interpretation that many continental religious were reimagined to have Irish roots, a process that I lay out in a forthcoming article. Now, I want to return to the date with which we began, as sort of as a coda, 597. However we regard 597 from an interpretive standpoint, to argue with Bede's artistry in framing his Historia Ecclesiastica seems to me an exercise in futility. Bede clearly thought in terms of greater meaning than mean facts could bear. Though perhaps Bede could have made a mistake of fact, there is no mistaking his truth. For Bede, 597 was the birth of English Christianity. And in order for that parturition to obtain, something old had to die. Bede himself died in 735, but he considered his Historia Ecclesiastica complete in 731, appending to it as he did a sort of curriculum vitae in Book 5, Chapter 25. Ironically enough, his De Locis Sanctis does not appear in that list. While some recension families continue rude analytic entries past this date, it seems evident that Bede saw fit to rest his chattering pen in 731. Why? Perhaps chiasm could point the way. If we are to regard 597 as a crucial date for Bede, then the substance of his historical vision ranges 134 years to 731. Finding a midpoint in 67 years hence the death of Columba and the coming of Augustine, and 67 years hither to his end date, we are pointed to the year 664. The very year in which Bede alleges the Council of Whitby took place. This council, which witnessed the partisans of Iona debating the partisans of Canterbury, would then be the midpoint of Bede's focus. This, I think, is not a mistake, but evidence of a deliberate design on Bede's part. If my argument has succeeded, that Bede's vision of salvific history as it pertains to the Irish would be reason to pause. If, as I have argued, Bede approached salvation history from a perspective of ethnography, and if the Irish have some crucial role to play in that ethnically charged field, then the Council of Whitby would seem to underscore that point. For Bede, the Irish and their great religious expatriates, Columba included, were soteriologically essential, not only to the Gentes Anglorum, but also to the world. Thank you. You're on mute, Alex. It's chilly up there in Boston, huh?
Yeah, but I was feeling a bit out of place without the hat. So
it's so luminous.
It is. I want to doff my hat to you, Justin. Thank you for a wonderful, rich presentation. Fantastic way to conclude the series, and very rich presentation. So thank you. We just want to open up for any questions that the audience may have. If you want to put in your questions in the chat function, I can relay them to Justin. So just thanks coming in. Yeah, this is a question from John Giblin in Galway. It's more of a general contemporary question, but today's world is a bit different from that of St. Columba. Can we learn anything from him that can be applied to the problems that we have today, such as Brexit, migration into Europe, secularization of society, class discrimination, world poverty, etc.? So kind of more of a kind of, contemporary.
The thinking about that is one of the reasons I got into this gig in the first place, because I find that, exploring the distant past allows you to think through ideas with a little bit less, that are the less pressing concerns. I mean, if we are to regard Bede's esteem of Irish people as important in some way, it's certainly not as important as the global economy and the seemingly willful self-destruction of the United Kingdom. I think that one thing that emerges, at least for me, in considering and contemplating Columba, is the fact that the Irish Sea is actually a tie that binds, right, and not a mechanism of separation. And that little Englanders and little Irelanders as well are both somewhat amiss, because the social and cultural and ethnic landscape of the early insular Middle Ages was profoundly diverse. And it wouldn't have made a whole lot of sense, I think, to Columba to willfully extricate yourself from a larger communion, which we could regard the European Union as being. Now, with regards to secularization, I think that, especially in Columba's own sort of background as a member of a royal house, but also in his continued kind of prosecuting of relationships, especially with the kings that he encountered, that the political side of things ought to be receptive to the religious side of things. I don't think a distinction between politics and religion would have made much sense for Columba, to be honest with you. We have altered our thinking there, but not totally. I'm from New Orleans, and we still have the school days follow the liturgical calendar. We get we have fish on Friday in New Orleans public schools and things like that. So I don't think secularization is nearly as complete as people think it is. And maybe Columba would say that's a good thing. I don't know. I'm not sure. If you have a time machine, I'd like to go ask him.
Thanks, thanks, Just. Can you talk a little bit more about your final point about the dating? Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Certainly. The idea is that Bede had 4 more years to write. So why did he stop in 731? And the argument I'm trying to advance is that he did that intentionally in order to make a sort of elaborate chiasm of his work, regarding 597 as an important date and his election to stop writing in 731. The midpoint there between would be 664, and if his theme is indeed reconciliation, then that marks an episode of reconciliation between various competing Christian camps in his world. So it's a point that I yanked from a talk I gave in graduate school, but I find it to be revealing. Because Bede was such a masterful craftsman of prose. I mean, nothing in the Historia Ecclesiastica is a mistake, really. I mean, he's so deliberate and intentional in his crafting of language. So
yeah, and it's not a point that I've heard before. So that's very, very interesting. Just if there's any more questions. Let's see here. Oh yes. Yeah. Can you comment on Bede with respect to Columbanus? Why might he not have referenced him in his writings, such as Columba?
The memory serves, he does reference Columbanus once. I believe it is in the second book, toward the end. But he doesn't delay. And this is actually something that you have discussed in some of your work before, Alex, that the Irish abroad always seem to be someone else's problem, right? That continental historians, for instance, aren't going to focus on that. Irish historians, well, they left Ireland, so why do I care? But it's really in that sort of experience of being in exile, right? Where there's a lot of revealing things that transpire with regard to perceptions of ethnicity and the like. And so I think one of the reasons why Bede doesn't remain and linger on Columbanus is because he simply falls off the radar, right? He goes to the continent, and if Bede is truly concerned with the Historia Ecclesiastica Hentis Anglorum, he's not going to chase down this Irish peregrinator into Merovingian Francia. So. But that's my sense for it. I haven't really looked into that question, but looking into his mention, I believe it's in the latter part of book 2, but it only happens once. So
no. And maybe a final question from Jeffrey Slater. How plausible is it that Bede was reluctantly appreciative of the Irish contribution, i.e., to what extent was Bede in fact an English nationalist? As he is sometimes portrayed to be. Historiographically, was this perceived feature of his work due to the patronage of the monasteries at Wearmouth, Jarrow?
Wow, what a remarkable question. If Bede were to come back today and find that his remains were lying in a Protestant church, he would be angry. The idea that because his remains are in Durham Cathedral, and you can go and you can actually say a prayer to Bede. As a Catholic, I thought my head would light on fire, but it didn't. But the idea is, I think that Bede was adopted by English authors in their forging of English identity after the Reformation. Bede becomes less a European property and more a national property with the advent of the nation state and the sort of forging of Great Britain, right? The UK more generally. I don't think Bede would have recognized insularity, ironically speaking. He was very much an expansive thinker and an inclusive thinker. Except when it regards the Britons, as I mentioned in the talk. He is relentlessly vituperative when it comes to the Britons. They never look good. They're always perfidious and just awful, right? But again, I think that's probably, as I said, the proximity principle. When you are close, when you are near neighbors, people have a tendency to look worse. Yes.
And it's something, I suppose, that's in our fields because of the specialisms that, so Anglo-Saxon studies and Irish studies or Celtic studies, there's been these kind of disciplinary kind of straitjackets in a way, which I think have been.
I think those are being torn asunder, but I certainly think that a part of that is just the specialization in languages. Right, in order to really hit, the early medieval Irish history, you need pretty good Old Irish, and in order to really understand Anglo-Saxon history, for instance, you really need pretty good Old English, and to develop a familiarity with both of those requires a rare bird. Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much again, Justin, for just concluding the series and bring us full circle really from Tom O'Loughlin's talk earlier in the year. So thank you again, all of you, for joining us this evening and for supporting this series over the past few months. All of the lectures have been recorded and I've made them available on my own YouTube channel and also the YouTube channel of the Loyola Institute at Trinity College Dublin. And we wish you and your families a blessed and peaceful Christmas. Slán agus Beannacht.